Welcome back to the OSM channel. In today's video I'm going to do some front end work on this 2005 Honda Pilot. Specifically in today's video I'm going to teach how to replace the front lower control arms, the front steering stabilizer, as well as the front CV shaft. Now this repair should be the same for model years 2003 through 2008, so without further ado, let's get started. First thing you're going to want to do is chock the rear wheels. Also, this wheel looks like it's low, so it probably has a nail in it. I'll have to address that later. With the front tire still on the ground, utilizing a 3/4 inch socket wrench and a breaker bar, we're going to crack all these lug nuts loose. Not take them off, we're just going to crack them loose. If you look right behind the front tire, you will find the jacking plate, so position your floor jack underneath this jacking plate and jack up the car. With the car jacked up, we can go ahead and remove the front tire. So currently the front end of the car is only being held up with that floor jack right now. Now if that fails, it could be a death sentence, so I'd recommend you installing a jack stand underneath this front frame rail right here. So if you follow the lower control arm, you'll find this front frame rail that runs towards the front of the car. So I'm just going to install this under here, and this will be a little bit of added protection. Because I'm going to be replacing the front pads and rotors, I do not mind if these components get damaged. So what I would like to do now is create some separation between the pads and rotors to allow me to easily remove this caliper. So I'm going to utilize this pry bar, sneak it in here, and I'm going to pry against the rotor, and I'm going to pry on the metal part of the brake pad itself. As you can see, we've created some separation here, and this will make it much easier to remove this caliper. Now it is time to remove the caliper. Prior to removing the caliper, you should either purchase or manufacture a caliper hanging hook. This is something I manufactured on my own. And this is what we're going to hang the caliper on to ensure that we don't put any pressure on the brake hose. So what you're going to need now is a 12mm socket. We're going to remove this bolt as well as this bolt right here. Now we can pull our caliper off the caliper brackets. I'm going to get my hanging hook, hook it in the slot, and then I'm just going to hang it up on the shroud for the front strut right here. That's up out of the way, no pressure on the brake line. Important. Now it's time to remove the caliper bracket. In order to do that, we need to remove this 17mm bolt, and there's another one hiding right behind this slide pin right here. Now on the rotor, I see that there are two Phillips head screws that we need to remove, and these screws can be tricky. Here's my technique. I like to take a number 3 Phillips and use an adapter. I have a 3/8 inch drive socket wrench, so this socket basically adapts 3/8 inch drive to that number 3 bit. Of course, we're spinning this counterclockwise, so I'll position this on the fastener, put a little bit of tension on it. Then I take a hammer and I lightly tap top of my socket wrench and provide rotational torque at the same time. See that it's starting to go. And I believe that is the best way to remove these stubborn brake rotor screws. So something else you can do, I've done in the past that seems to help a little bit, is you take the backside of a ball peen hammer and just strike the head of the fastener a few times. I'm a terrible shot, but in theory that just helps to break it loose a little bit. And with those two fasteners removed, now you can try and take off your rotor. In this case, the rotor is going to come off easy. If it does not want to budge and it seems to be seized on there, hit in between the lugs. What I've done in the past, had good success with it, is I've used actually a solid metal bar or a chisel to hit in between the lugs, because really that's the spot where this rotor corrodes to the hub. So that's really where you want to focus your energy. If all else fails, you could start whacking on the sides too, but again, this is where the corrosion really occurs. Next, I need to remove this axle nut. Now, it would have been smart to loosen up this axle nut with the tire on the ground. I forgot to do it, so we're just going to proceed forward anyway. But if you take a look at this CV axle shaft, you could see a little indent right here. And the purpose of that indent is to prevent this axle nut from spinning off. Looks like that indent is slightly off to the side of this little cutout right here, but I've just a little blunt tip chisel, and we're just going to try and straighten that out a little bit to ensure we don't face any more resistance than we have to while removing this nut. So the size of this axle nut is likely going to be metric. I don't have metric sockets that big. I do have an 1 7/16" socket on me, and you can see there's a little bit of play in it, but I think it'll work just fine. Anyway, this axle nut is on here pretty darn tight, so in order to help alleviate the situation, I have a small butane torch, and I'm just going to heat up this nut for a few minutes, and we'll see if we can get it to crack loose. Oh, that baby's on there. That butane torch was just not putting enough heat on this nut, so I'm breaking out the oxyacetylene torch, and we're going to put a lot more heat on this nut. If you don't have an oxyacetylene torch, you could try a MAP gas torch. That may get you by. Yeah, there she is. Just needed some heat. Again, I believe it's going to be much easier to crack that axle nut loose with the tire still on the ground. There's actually a little plastic cap on the rim that pops right out that will allow you to do that. The only trouble is if you do need to apply heat to this nut, you're not going to be able to do it with the rim on. So in a way, it's almost necessary that you take the rim off. But anyway, let's remove this nut off the rest of the way. It's going to be very hot, by the way. Beautiful. Alright, so let's take a look at what we have going on down here and what we are going to replace. So we have the lower control arm. We're going to replace this entire assembly. We're also going to replace the CV shaft. The reason we're replacing the CV shaft is because the boot is torn, the inner boot is torn, and there's grease everywhere. And also we're going to replace this steering stabilizer right here, this linkage here. Now I'm going to attempt to do this without removing this connection right here. This is the tie rod end connection for the steering rack system, right? So this controls the steering. Not sure if we're going to have to remove that. If we do, it's not the end of the world, but we're going to try and do this job without removing it. So I figure the first thing we need to remove is this lower ball joint connection between the knuckle and the lower control arm. There she is. Butane torch has redeemed itself. Now to complete the separation, I'm going to use this fork. Try and make the separation between this lower ball joint and the knuckle. So I'm just going to beat the back of this fork with a big hammer and we'll see if they separate. Easy. So after you've worked the ball joint loose with a fork between the lower control arm and the knuckle, how do you remove this connection the rest of the way? Well, here's how you do it. So take a look at the lower control arm. There's actually a hole right in here, and that's your leverage hole. So if you get yourself a long pry bar or something along those lines, you'll be able to put a lot of downward force on this lower control arm. From there, as you're applying downward force, that should drop out. And then you just move the knuckle out of the way, and that is how you remove it the rest of the way. Now to remove the lower control arm off the rest of the way, there's two more bolts that we need to remove. So there's a bolt right here, right below the oil filter. This is going to be a 19mm. We'll try it with the impact. It's a little tight in here. Alright, that's a good sign. Then we have one more, which I think we're going to have to get on the creeper for. And here's our other fastener, so I believe we need to remove this from the bottom, and this should also be a 19mm. So I'm still struggling with that rear lower control arm bolt. I was using the butane torch, but it's just not putting enough heat on the nut. I've been hesitant to use the hot wrench because I don't want to accidentally create a grease fire, but at this point I pretty much have no choice because I don't have an impact powerful enough to just remove that. So I put a couple metal plates here to hopefully help deflect the heat. I have 2 fire extinguishers within an arm's reach, and I'm just going to be very careful about how I direct the heat and pay attention to what I'm doing here. So hoping for the best. So I think that just about did it. Just to show you what I had to engineer here. 3/4 inch drive socket wrench with a 1/2 inch adapter to go down to, what, 19 mil. And I have a piece of conduit as my leverage bar. And then I have a ratchet strap going to the rear tire to increase my pulling power. But I started ratcheting on the ratchet strap, and I did feel some tension start to give way. So either we're shearing something or it's actually starting to spin. Let me position the camera and I'll keep working this bolt off. So it took about a half hour of struggling to get that bolt out, but I did get it out. Advice to you, be patient with it, keep heating it up, don't set the car on fire. It eventually should come out or it'll snap. If it snaps, you know, then it turned a 3-hour job into a 6-hour job probably. But anyway, look at the threads on this bolt, completely gone. So we got to order new bolts. Because I'm doing control arms on both sides of the car, I'm going to assume that the bolt on the other side of the car is going to do the same thing. So I just want to share with you the part number. So I've done some research, and this is the part number for that bolt. So it's a Honda 90118-S as in Sam, 0 X as in X-ray, dash A as in Adam, 01. You can buy them online from this Honda Parts Now website. I think on Amazon they're like ridiculously priced. They're like $15 a bolt. Cheapest place to get this is dealership. Called around 2 dealerships. You can get each one of these bolts for about $4 a piece, but you got to go in there to order them. If you order them through Honda Parts Now, it'll cost probably double that, be about $16. And here's the parts diagram. So this is part number 15, if I'm not mistaken. No, excuse me, 16. This is part number 16. That's where the bolt goes up through the control arm. 15 is the one that goes in control arm horizontally. This is the vertical bolt, and that is the one you're going to have problems with. 15, horizontal bolt, really no problems, zipped right out. So now it's time to remove the CV shaft. Now if you're looking to save the CV shaft, then obviously you should reinstall the axle nut and then tap this through with a hammer on that axle nut as opposed to the end of the shaft. But because this is getting replaced and I don't care about it, I'm just going to take a big old hammer and start tapping it out of here. Pry bar on the backside. So now here's the question, how do you get the CV axle shaft out of the transmission? Well, I watched a video online a minute ago where some guys went back up in there and used a pry bar to try and pry it out. I didn't see any really good pry points, so I figure we'll start with the most simplistic method, and that's just trying to pull it straight out. And well, we got a piece of it. The other half is in there, but you could see where the boot kind of tore and there's a bunch of oil on this shaft, so not sure if this is going to make this easier or more difficult, but I figure we'll get this out of the way anyway. So I've been trying to get the end of this CV axle housing out of this Honda Pilot for probably 2 or 3 hours now. Did a quick search on YouTube, found this guy that pretty sure he has the solution, so we're going to try his solution. I'll give him a shout out down below. But anyway, what you need to do, you need to cut the boot off the inner part of your old CV shaft. Good idea to clean it up. That's going to be helpful. So we have the bearings. We're going to reinstall the bearings on these shafts. Chance they may drop. So we're going to try and hold these into position, and we're going to slide this back into a part of the CV shaft that's still stuck on the vehicle. Why doesn't it want to go? Come on. It's interesting. Nothing's easy, huh? That should go right in there. What in tarnation? Oh, come on. I think I just gotta play with it. Don't fall. Okay. No, come on. Alright, so I have everything slid back in the housing. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a simple vice grip and I'm just going to pinch it on the inner lip right here. And this should be adjusted. If you want, you could actually install 2 vice grips. That's not a bad idea. Might go see if I have another one. And I have another vice grip and we'll pinch it on the inner lip here. Alright, so I have everything reinstalled into the housing, have 2 vice grips pinching the edge of this. And what we made is basically a free slide hammer. So I'm going to try sliding this in and out, I don't know, several times, and we'll see if we can get this to go. Ah, there she is. Ha-ha! Great success. That is the trick right there, ladies and gentlemen. That is how you get that sucker out of there. Alright, so I didn't film what just happened, but I just want to show you what I did and how I made it work. So, the new CV shaft did not include one of these dust shields. I'm going to call it a dust shield. Anyway, I was able to pull this off the old CV shaft with this 3-jaw puller that was included in my slide hammer kit. So my technique, I hooked this on, I put a nut in here, right, so the center of the puller was pressing against a nut inside the CV axle shaft center, and that in conjunction with a little chisel, I was able to pull this piece right off. And then as for pressing it onto the new CV shaft, I used a ginormous socket. This is a 2-inch socket, fit right in. Oh no, excuse me, I didn't use a 2-inch, I used an 1 3/4 inch. So 1 3/4 inch socket, hammered it right down, and things are good. So the final component we need to remove is the steering stabilizer, and this is going to be removed with an 18mm socket. Man, no bolts want to break free easy today, huh? Oh wow. So with this steering stabilizer, you want to be careful because this is actually under compression right now. If I take my pry bar, pry in between the stabilizer bar and the frame itself, look at the connection. So there's actually a strong amount of compression right here. So you got to be careful when you remove this. So what I'm going to attempt to do is just relieve that tension like so, and then remove the nut. This is kind of awkward. I'm wearing safety glasses, by the way, and of course, see it's spinning a little bit. Get a pair of vice grips on this. So there's an inner nut in here and it may start spinning, so you may just have to take a pair of vice grips and pinch it to ensure that things don't get away from you. Okay, that's good and tight. Move this nut. Knock this out of the way. And slowly relieve that tension on that arm. We'll remove the upper connection. So I should be able to get this upper stabilizer connection with my impact. And that nut is right there. Here you have it. One steering stabilizer. Now let's install the new steering stabilizer. The thing I like about this one is it has grease fittings. So that is a nice touch. So now we need to make our lower connection, and I'm just going to take the pry bar. Again, get a purchase on the frame. Compress this down. Try not to get my fingers in the way of danger. Add a few pumps of grease to the grease fittings here. A few days later, time to get back to work on this project. I figured the first thing we'll do is reinstall that lower control arm. As you can see, the new bolts came in, right? So these are the vertical bolts that go in. You can see the marring on the threads of the old bolt that I took off. Again, we got 2 of these. Here's the part number. If you do plan to do this job, good idea to order these bolts ahead of time. That way you know you'll have them. Also, what's interesting is off camera I took this bolt and I threaded it into the framework that receives this bolt, and it went right in. I was worried I was going to have to re-tap the nut that receives this bolt, but I had no issues threading this bolt in there. So as for what marred these threads, I don't know, just corrosion and maybe some schmutz got in there, I don't know. But anyway, this is trash. We got the new bolts. They're going to work out just fine. Have the new lower control arms here. They're from Detroit Axle. Let's install those now and see how easy they go in. Should be a lot easier than taking them out, that's for sure. So these lower control arms, there is a left side and a right side one, so whatever side you take off, you just want to match it, but it should slide in here and the ball joint should face up. So I'm hoping this slides right in, which looks like it's going in. Really no issue. And then as for the 2 bolts, here are the 2 bolts. One is longer and one is shorter. If you look, the new bolt is shorter. So the shorter bolt is going to go towards the rear of the car. That's going to be that vertical bolt. And the horizontal bolt is going to be this longer bolt. And again, we had no issues removing this. So we're going to start these bolts by hand. I'm going to switch over to the impact. And again, these should be a 19mm socket. Quick tip if you have trouble getting this bolt started. So I got down low, I'm on a creeper right now. I took my right hand, you can see I grabbed on the end of the control arm with the ball joint on it, and I lifted up. You may have to shift this in and out a little bit, but I found that once I lifted this up slightly, that little bit of movement aligned the holes enough as to where I was able to get that bolt started. Now that it's started, I can tighten her up. Tighten up the other bolt. So at this point we need to reinstall the new CV axle shaft, and you're not going to be able to see it on camera, but there are internal splines in here, and I did lubricate the internal splines. As you'll recall, it was a little bit difficult pulling the end of this shaft off. Let's see how easy it is to slide it back in. There she goes. Yeah. So a few things I've learned in terms of installing this new CV shaft. 1, ensure that the splines are jiving. 2, You can actually use this as kind of like a slide hammer to reinstall it. The inner part of this CV coupling is a series of round bearings that slide within a channel. So, I mean, if you get the inner part of the shaft started and you find that you can't really get it on further, you can actually slide it forward like that, and that will help to drive this shaft onto the transmission splines. Additionally, if you need to, what helped me get started, if you have a nut on the end of the CV axle and you just lightly tap this in, ensuring that everything's lined up and you have these splines jiving, that will help you to get this started. Have a little bit of patience. Took me about 10 minutes to get it on. Also ensure that you lubricate the splines on the inner part of the shaft, and we're also going to lubricate the splines here, but just got to be strong. Have a little bit of patience. You'll be able to get it done. So my lower control arm had this protective cover over that lower ball joint, so ensure you remove this protective cover. Have my pry bar going through the pry hole in the lower control arm. So this may take you a few tries, but we're going to attempt to pry this lower control arm down and line up this lower ball joint bolt in the lower hole in the knuckle of the steering assembly. Thinking it might be easier to do this with the wheels turned to the right. You can also use the leg hook method. I'm going to hook my leg over the end of this pry bar. Use my hands to rotate the knuckle. It's almost lined up. There we go. Let's reinstall this castle nut for the ball joint. This case, one I got is from Detroit Axle, and this is a 21 mil. Don't take my word for it though, check yourself. So now it is time to service the caliper bracket, and this is really important for proper brake operation. So there's two components that we're going to service here. One, we're going to service the slide pins, and then we're going to replace, but we're also going to clean underneath these brake pad slide clips, I'm going to call them. Well, in order to pop these out, simply hold the boot with one finger, and then I like to rotate the pin and pull outwards, and that will allow the slide pin to pop off. You can see we have some old, looks like a black type of grease. So what I like to do, I like to just take a clean paper towel, and we're just going to get as much of this old gook off here as possible. Inspect the pins for wear, anything of that nature. And these look like they're in relatively good condition, which is good. So I'll insert it back into the boot, give it a couple rotations, pull it out again. Get as much of that old grease out of there as possible. Now, as for re-lubricating these pins, I'll tell you, in the past I've used this ceramic brake parts lubricant, but I just watched an interesting video last night of an automotive shop that specializes in brake jobs, and they applied this stuff to some of their pins, and they had a customer's car come back maybe 2 or 3 years later, and these pins were bat seized, so they advised against using ceramic brake parts lubricant for the slide pins. What they do recommend using is just silicone paste. This stuff's a little expensive. I think it's like 15 bucks a jug, or for a little container like this, but this is what I'm going to use from now on due to what I learned in that video. So silicone paste, just going to lubricate the pin. I'll dip the brush back in here. I like to put a good dab on the end of this pin. People have disagreed with me in the comments section when I've done brake jobs in the past about this. We're going to insert this back in here and just, rotate it, pop it back in. But the reason they've said that's not okay is because, well, due to the low tolerances in here, if you put a dab of silicone on the end right there, it's going to not allow this pin to slide back and forth. Let me tell you, there's a little bit of clearance in here between the pin and the boot, and by putting a big dab of lubricant in there, that will allow that lubricant to backfeed up the pin over time. And in my opinion, that's just the right way to do it, but you can do whatever you want. You know, this isn't a hydraulic cylinder here. This is a slide pin, and as you can see, this is working out much better than what it was. Works out just fine. So we'll do the same thing on the other side off camera, and then we'll move on to the clips. So I just finished servicing the slide pins, and as you can see, they move freely on their own now. They're properly lubricated, so they should be good to go for quite some time. Now the next thing we're going to want to replace and service are these brake pad slide brackets, and this is critical. A lot of people skip this step, and it often costs them an early brake job. So if you live in the Northeast, the Rust Belt, or even in the South, what will happen is underneath these slide brackets, rust and corrosion and buildup will occur between the slide bracket and this bracket. And that schmutz that builds up underneath the slide bracket decreases the clearance between the ends of the brake pad. So if I put this brake pad in here right now before servicing this bracket, for one, it's tight and difficult to get this brake pad in here because of that schmutz that has built up in between the slide and the bracket. But look at the amount of force it takes to slide this brake pad on and off. Like, I know you can't really tell, but it takes probably 5 pounds of force to slide this brake pad on and off. So this brake pad is getting a little bit stuck in here. I've seen them a lot worse, but this is by no means acceptable. So what are we going to do to correct this and allow the brakes to function properly? Well, for one, we're going to pop off the old slide brackets, and we can simply do that with a flathead screwdriver. Just get in here between the bracket. They just pop off, no big deal. Do the same thing on the other side. Take a look at that rust and corrosion that's built up underneath there. That's no good. Sometimes it gets so bad that you need to take something a little bit more aggressive than a wire brush to work this back down, but this is just a critical step in ensuring that the brake pads have enough clearance within the slide brackets to slide on and off easily. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mask up. I'm going to take this wire brush. Sorry, the focus has been acting up a little bit right here, but I'm going to put on a mask, take this wire brush, and just brush this down real good. Sure that there's no rust buildup. Just get all this corrosion and schmutz off here. So you can see we have this caliper bracket all cleaned up. It's nice and shiny. In order to protect this shiny metal surface, at this point, I'm going to break out the ceramic brake parts lubricant, and I'm just going to apply a light layer to where we just cleaned off. And the ideology behind this will help to prevent this metal from rusting, which in turn should help to prevent any rust buildup. So now that we have that shiny clean metal protected from the elements, now it's time to tap on the new slides. Now, I found that when you buy cheaper brake pads like the kit that I bought, oftentimes what will happen, they will send you out a slide kit that has multiple sized slides. See, in this case we have a wider slide, and then if we compare it to this lower one, see how this one's a little bit narrower? So this bracket does require the wider slides, and you can just simply match them up, but all you do is just line these up. They basically attach without much force. Normally what I like to do is just take a hammer as well and lightly tap them on just to ensure they're fully seated, but it really shouldn't require much to get them on there. See, these are kind of like low grade slides, so they do rebound off a little bit, but it's the best we're going to do. So now I have one of the new brake pads, and I just want to show you how easy it should be now to slide these pads within the bracket. So let's pop this in here. And watch this. You ready for this? That's how easy it should be to slide the pads on those slide brackets. So that's why it's so critical that you take the time to properly maintain your caliper bracket. I also forgot to mention, before we install the rotor, you want to ensure that your hub is clean. In this case, I'm not feeling any buildup there's a little bit of surface rust, so what I'm going to do is just take a wire brush and gently scrub off some of this rust. Just make sure there's nothing that's going to cause the rotor to be unbalanced with the hub, right? So if you had a little speck of debris right here, it would cause the rotor to flare out where that little speck of debris is, and then you would feel that as you're going down the road. So it's really important that this hub is really clean for when it's time to mate the brake rotor onto the hub. Another thing I like to do, take some Never Seas and just give this a light coat. Just paint it on here. And again, this should help to prevent that rotor from rusting and getting seized onto the hub. And it also helps to prevent any corrosion that may want to form on the hub. So now it's time to install the rotor. As you can see, the first thing that I've done is I've put the rotor on the hub backwards in the opposite direction. Reason being, there's a light layer of oil on this rotor, so we're just going to take some brake parts cleaner, spray off the rotor. I like to take a paper towel and we'll just wipe off this oil. And what we're going to do is we're going to flip it around, but take a look at the rotor. There's a few holes here. See, we have some flared holes. The flared holes are where you need to line up on the hub the holes for the holding screws. All right, so the holding screw is going to go right here, and a holding screw is going to go right here. So you see we have a flared hole here and here, so we're just going to line that up. And now as for these other two holes here and here, well, these are going to be really nice for the next guy that has to do a brake job on this car. These are designed to help remove this rotor if it is seized on the hub. So you'll find the appropriately sized bolt. Of course, after you remove all the lug nuts and the holding screws, you would simply install those two removal bolts, and they will force this to pull off the hub in the future. So that's a really nice touch. Again, we're going to take some brake parts cleaner, spray this down. So now let's reinstall the rotor once more, ensuring that all our holes are lined up properly. And I know you're looking at the rotor this time and thinking, well, looks a little bit different than it did last time. Well, that is true. What I did, I taped off the surface of the rotor that normally mates to the brake pad, and I've painted the center of the rotor. Reason being is I tend to use cheap brake pads and rotors, which normally there's no problem. However, the only issue that I found with the cheap rotors is that the center of the rotor tends to rust, and that will make this rotor look very ugly, you know, a year or two down the road, because you see all this rust right here through the wheel. So what you can do to help prevent that is to tape off, again, the outer edge of the rotor. Try and get all the oil off and just take some high performance black Rust-Oleum and just give it a quick paint job. It doesn't take much. Trust me, this will really help the appearance of the car moving further down the road here. And you know, if you overspray a little bit onto this surface, don't worry about it. I mean, that's going to wear off real quick, so it doesn't take much, but it's going to make a huge difference. So now it's time to reinstall the holding screws, and again, these are a number 3 Phillips. And I like to just put a little bit of ceramic brake parts lubricant on these screws. We'll start them by hand. Next, let's reinstall the caliper bracket. These should be two 17mm bolts. We're going to start these by hand. I've decided that I'm going to apply a small amount of ceramic brake parts lubricant to the slide bracket, so I'm going to apply some here, 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 and right here. Now it is time to install the new brake pads. Now, the brake pads, one of them should have this wear indicator or squealer, and the other one will not. The pad that has the squealer should go on the inboard side of the caliper bracket. Now, the purpose of this little metal squealer is to make a sound, a squeal if you will, when the brake pad wears down to the point that there's not much pad left, maybe 1/16 of an inch of pad left. So if you hear your brakes making really strange sounds, chances are you need to replace your brakes. So I'm going to start by installing the inner pad with the squealer. See how easy that slides on and off? That's how it should be. 100%, that's how it should be. Then we will install the outer pad. See how easy that slides on and off? So before we reinstall the caliper piston, the final thing we need to install are these release springs. So if you take a look at the pads, there's going to be a hole here and here, and there should be one here and here. So we're simply going to take this, insert it into those little holes, and you may have to hold the pads, compressed, because otherwise they'll pop off. But you take a look, the V should go towards the center. So we'll do the same thing on the lower one here, like that. And now things get a little bit awkward because you kind of got to hold this in place with one hand, and then you got to try and grab the caliper bracket and ensure that your brake line isn't twisted. So we'll just slide this right over, should go right in. Caliper piston is preventing those pads from popping off. And then I'm just adjusting these slide pins to allow the caliper bracket to slide in, right? So this slide pin just pushed it in a little bit. Move it up a little bit, line everything up. Then we need to reinstall these bolts, which bolt into the slide pins. There's a little metal tab that you may have to rotate a little bit. No big deal. Get these bolts started by hand. Top one is started. So for this lower bolt, you see there's the metal tab on the slide pin, so I do need to rotate this slightly. See that popped in now? May need to adjust this a little bit, but just again, start these by hand. Should go right in. Now I'm going to tighten up these two slide pin bolts. I'm going to do that with my 3/8" drive ratchet because I don't want to over torque these. Now we can reinstall the tire. With all those lug nuts started, somewhat tight, I'm gonna gently lower the car back down on the ground. Then we need to torque down these lug nuts. According to my research, lug nuts should be torqued down to 80 foot-pounds, so I have my torque wrench set to 80 foot-pounds. Now just about the final thing we need to do here is to torque down this CV axle nut. Now prior to installing the wheel, I removed this little plastic cap with a flathead screwdriver. This just pops off, little plastic cap. According to my research, the torque on this nut should be 242 foot-pounds if I'm not mistaken. So I have my torque wrench set to 242 foot-pounds, and I'm going to try with all my might to get this torque down properly. That is torqued down properly. So I do not have the workshop manual. When I removed this nut, it looked like somebody punched the flange of this axle nut into this little alcove on the axle. So because that's what it looked like before, I'm gonna try and punch this flange down into this little cutout right here. And again, the idea behind that is to help prevent this axle nut from loosening up over time. However, if you need to take the axle nut off, it's going to make it more challenging. So we'll try and hammer this over a little bit. And it actually folded over just fine. I know I didn't really catch that on camera, but you could see it's dented in there. So I would say that is the right thing to do. And finally, we will take this little bitty hubcap, pop her in. Critically important step here. So the final step here, you need to go in the car and pump that brake pedal several times until the brakes become firm. Reason being, right now, because we compressed that caliper piston earlier, the brake pads are not making contact with the rotor. So if you throw the car in drive and try and hit the brake pedal down, chances are you will feel no resistance and you won't be able to properly stop. So it's important that you pump the brakes to extend or allow the caliper piston to extend out, therefore allow the pads to make contact with the rotor, and that will allow you to stop the vehicle. So let's go inside the car and pump the brakes. So watch what happens when I push down the brake. I'd imagine it's going to go all the way down to the floor right now. All the way down. So let's pump it again. And now it's firm. See how it's not going all the way down to the floor? Again, this is really important. Make sure you do this. Anyway, That's going to conclude today's video. Thanks for watching. As always, I will catch you on the next one.